They drove a widow off her land before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and by nightfall, the man they forgot about came back holding something no one in Dry Creek could outrun. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? And if you believe justice doesn't always come from a gun, stay with me. The morning had come in slow, pale light, stretching across the fence posts of Margaret Hale's ranch like it had every day for the past 12 years, quiet and honest, the kind of morning her husband used to say meant the land was still theirs. Margaret stood on her porch in worn boots, fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee cup, watching dust drift across the yard in thin ribbons. When the riders appeared at the edge of her property, three silhouettes cutting through the heat like something out of a bad memory. They didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't need to, because men like that carried something louder than noise. And when they stopped just 10 yards from her fence, the world seemed to hold its breath. The one in front swung down from his horse with a slow kind of confidence, boots landing soft in the dirt, coat clean despite the road, and he tipped his hat just enough to be polite without meaning it. "Mrs. Hale," he said, voice smooth as river stone. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Carter Boone." And Margaret didn't answer right away, just set her cup down on the railing, eyes steady, because she had learned a long time ago that words were often traps dressed as kindness. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat, held it out like it carried weight, and for a moment, the wind caught the edge of it, revealing a seal that looked official enough to scare most folks into silence. "Land transfer," he added, as if that settled everything, as if 12 years of sweat and seasons could be folded into a single page. Margaret stepped forward, the wood of the porch creaking under her weight, and took the paper with hands that didn't shake, not yet, scanning. Lines written by someone who had never stood on this soil, never buried a man beneath it, never listened to the wind move through empty rooms at night. "This ain't right," she said quietly, more to the air than to him, and the man gave a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "It's signed," he replied, nodding toward the bottom of the page. "And out here, that's what matters." And somewhere behind him, one of the other riders shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking soft, like a warning that didn't need to be spoken. Margaret looked past them, out toward the horizon, where the land stretched wide and stubborn, where memory lived longer than men, and for a second, just one, something flickered in her expression, not fear, not yet, but the weight of knowing she stood alone. She folded the paper carefully, like it might break if handled wrong, and set it back in his hand. "This land was my husband's," she said, voice steady now. "And he never signed anything away." And the man shrugged, almost apologetic, as if the truth didn't matter anymore. "Then I suppose," he said, glancing around at the empty yard, "he should have stayed alive long enough to say so." And the words hung there, not cruel, not loud, just final, like a door closing somewhere far behind her. Margaret didn't argue after that, didn't reach for anything, didn't raise her voice. Because sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is walk away from something they know is still theirs. And as she stepped off that porch, boots hitting the dust one last time, the wind picked up just enough to carry the smell of dry earth and old wood. And somewhere 5 miles out, a man who hadn't set foot in Dry Creek for years lifted his head like he'd just heard something break. Margaret Hale did not look back when she reached the end of her fence line, because some things only hurt if you turn around and measure how much you have lost. The road stretched ahead in a thin ribbon of dust. 1 mile, then 2, her boots steady despite the weight pressing down on her chest, and in her hands she carried that small tin box, dinted at the corners, the only thing she had chosen not to leave behind. Inside it, wrapped in cloth worn soft by years, lay a handful of letters, a rusted key, and something else she had not opened in a long time. Behind her, Dry Creek settled into its usual rhythm as if nothing had happened. Men returning to their business. Carter Boone's name spoken a little louder than before, like a man who had just reminded everyone where the lines were drawn. By noon, Boone himself stood on the porch that had never belonged to him, staring out across land he did not understand, tapping a finger against the post as if ownership could be learned through repetition. "Tear down that old fence," he said to one of his men, not raising his voice, because control did not need volume. "I want new markers by morning." And the man nodded, moving off without question, because men like Boone did not ask twice. The wind picked up again, carrying the dry scent of sage and sunburned wood, brushing against the empty space where Margaret's chair had sat for 12 years, and for a moment, the house felt different, not fuller, not stronger, just quieter in the wrong way. 5 miles out, where the land dipped low and the road curved around a narrow ridge, a black horse stood still as carved stone, its rider watching the horizon with eyes that had learned patience the hard way. Elias Crow had not planned to return, not to this town, not to any place that remembered his name, but something in the air had shifted, something that did not sit right in his bones. And when a passing ranch hand mentioned a widow being turned off her land before breakfast, Elias had not asked for details. He had only turned his horse. He rode slow, not because he was unsure, but because a man who moves too fast often arrives before the truth has time to catch up. The town came into view by late afternoon, a scatter of buildings under a sky that had not changed in years, and as Elias guided his horse down the main road, heads turned without meaning to, because some men carry silence the way others carry noise, and it draws attention all the same. He dismounted outside the saloon, boots landing soft against packed dirt, and for a second, he just stood there, taking in the shape of the place, the same warped boards, the same faded sign. Only the feeling had changed, like something honest had been replaced by something quicker, colder. Inside, voices carried low, cards sliding across wood, glasses set down with quiet finality, and when Elias stepped through the door, the room shifted in a way no one spoke about, eyes lifting, then dropping, as if remembering him came with a cost. He moved to the bar without hurry, placing his hat down with deliberate care, and the barkeep, older now, lines deeper around his eyes, froze just long enough to show recognition before reaching for a glass. "Been a while, Elias," he said, voice careful. And Elias nodded once, not offering more, because words were not what he had come for. Outside, the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the street, reaching toward Boone's newly claimed land. And somewhere between that fading light and the quiet inside the saloon, a reckoning began to take shape. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to be seen. The glass the barkeep set down in front of Elias Crow remained untouched, because a man does not drink when he is measuring a room, and Elias had been measuring rooms his whole life. The murmur inside the saloon settled into something thinner, like a thread stretched too tight, and no one said Carter Boone's name out loud, but it lingered there all the same. In the way chairs creaked and boots shifted against the floor, Elias rested one hand on the counter, fingers still, eyes moving slow, across familiar faces that now looked away a second too late, and in that silence, the barkeep leaned in just enough to speak without being heard by the wrong ears. "He took her place before noon," the man said quietly, voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this happen before and done nothing about it. "Said he had papers, real ones this time." And Elias did not answer, did not nod, just reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, worn at the edges, the kind of paper that had traveled more miles than most men in that room. He set it on the counter, not pushing it forward, just letting it exist there, and the barkeep's eyes dropped to it for half a second before snapping back up, because some things you do not look at unless you are ready to be part of them. Outside, the sound of hammering carried faint across the street. Wood, striking wood in steady rhythm, marking territory that did not belong to the man claiming it, and Elias listened to that sound like it was telling him something. Each strike a reminder that time does not wait for truth to catch up. He picked up his hat, placed it back on his head with the same care he had used before, and turned toward the door without finishing the drink, because whatever needed doing was not going to happen inside that room. When he stepped back into the light, the town seemed smaller somehow, like it had folded in on itself, and across the street, Boone stood near the fence line, watching men drive fresh posts into the ground, his hands resting easy at his sides, the posture of someone who believed ownership was already settled. Elias did not walk straight to him, not yet, instead crossing the street at an angle, boots slow against the dust, stopping just short of the old gate that had once marked the edge of Margaret's yard. One of Boone's men glanced up, hesitated, then went back to his work, because Elias had not said anything, and silence can be mistaken for permission by those who do not understand it. Elias reached out and touched the top of the gate, fingers brushing over wood worn smooth by years of use. And for a moment, he closed his eyes, not in grief, not in anger, but in recognition, as if the land itself was confirming something he had already known. Behind him, Boone's voice carried over, light but edged. You planning to stand there all evening, or did you come to say something? And Elias opened his eyes, turning just enough to meet the man's gaze. The distance between them no more than 20 feet, close enough for words, far enough for choices. He stepped forward then, one pace, then another, stopping where the new fence posts cut across the old line, and reached into his coat once more, pulling out the envelope and unfolding it with deliberate care, the paper catching the late sun in a way that made the seal glint faintly. No one moved as he held it there, not offering it yet, just letting it be seen. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying just far enough. You built all this on something you never checked. And the hammering stopped, not because he raised his voice, but because every man there understood that whatever came next was not about force, it was about truth. And truth has a way of arriving quiet before it changes everything. Boone did not step forward, not at first, because men who build their confidence on paper tend to hesitate when someone brings a better one. And the way Elias Crow held that document, steady, unshaken by wind or eyes, made the space between them feel narrower than it was. The late sun hung low behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the half-finished fence, stretching each post into something taller, something heavier. And for a moment, no one spoke, not Boone, not his men, not even the wind that had carried dust all afternoon. Elias lowered the paper just enough to look directly at Boone, his expression unreadable, not angry, not calm, just certain, and that certainty moved through the air like a quiet warning. You said you had papers, Elias continued, voice even, each word landing clean. But you never asked who filed the original claim. And Boone let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it did not reach his eyes. I asked enough, he replied, glancing briefly at the men around him as if their presence could steady the ground beneath his feet. And the county signed off on it. And there it was again, that reliance on something distant, something official, something he believed could not be challenged by a man standing alone in the dust. Elias nodded once, slow, acknowledging the claim without agreeing to it, and unfolded the paper fully now, letting the seal catch the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. County signs. What it is given, he said, they do not chase what was buried before it. And a faint murmur passed through the men working the fence, not loud enough to be called a reaction, just enough to show that doubt had begun to take shape. One of Boone's men straightened up, wiping his hands against his pants, eyes flicking between the two men as if trying to decide which direction the ground would tilt. Boone took a step closer then, closing part of the distance, his boots pressing into the same soil he had claimed hours earlier, and for a second, he reached out like he might take the paper, but stopped short, his hand hovering, because something in Elias's stillness made that gesture feel like a mistake waiting to happen. Then say what you came to say, Boone said, quieter now, the edge still there but thinner, stretched by uncertainty, and Elias did not rush the moment, did not fill the silence too quickly, because truth, when given time, settles deeper. He turned the paper slightly, angling it so the seal and the signature beneath it could be seen by more than just Boone, letting the men nearby catch a glimpse of lines drawn long before any of them had set foot on that land. This was filed 12 years ago, Elias said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the porch, the yard, the men who had been hammering moments before any of you ever thought to ride through here. And the name at the bottom sat there, ink faded but unmistakable, tied to records that lived beyond Dry Creek, beyond Boone's reach. Boone's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in calculation, the kind a man does when he realizes the ground beneath him might not hold. And what does that change? He asked, though the question lacked the certainty it once had. And Elias looked at him for a long second, then at the land, then back again, as if measuring not just the claim, but the man making it. It changes who had the right to decide, Elias said. Finally, and the words did not rise, did not strike, They simply settled, heavy and unavoidable, like something that had been waiting years to be spoken out loud. The wind shifted just enough to carry the sound of that sentence across the yard, and something changed in the way the men stood, not visibly at first, just a subtle tightening in their shoulders, a pause in their breathing. Because when truth begins to take shape, it does not arrive like a storm, it settles like dust, slow and impossible to ignore. Boone let his gaze drift from the paper to Elias, then to the land behind him, as if searching for something that would anchor him again, but the certainty he had carried all day was no longer sitting right. It had slipped, just slightly, and men like Boone feel that before they understand it. "You are telling me," he said carefully, choosing each word like it might cut the wrong way if he moved too fast, "that none of this belongs to me." And Elias did not answer right away, because the answer was already there, written in ink older than Boone's claim, older than the confidence he had walked in with that morning. Instead, Elias stepped forward one more pace, closing the distance until he stood just inside the line where the new posts had been driven into the ground, his boots resting on soil that remembered everything. He lowered the paper between them, not offering it, just placing it where both men could see, where the seal sat clear and unhidden, and for a long second, Boone looked at it without touching it, like a man staring at something he does not want to understand. "Your name is not on this land," Elias said finally, his voice steady, not loud, not sharp, just certain. And it never was. And that was the moment the silence deepened, not because of what was said, but because of what it meant. One of the men by the fence shifted again, stepping back without realizing it, as if distance might protect him from whatever direction this was turning. Boone exhaled slowly, his posture changing, not collapsing, not yet, but adjusting, recalculating, because men like him do not fall apart. They look for another way to stand. "Then whose name is?" he asked, and this time the question carried something new, not doubt exactly, but the first trace of it. Elias reached down and turned the paper just enough, angling it toward the fading light, and the name at the bottom caught that last bit of sun, clear despite the years, written with the kind of intention that does not fade even when the ink does. Boone leaned in, just slightly, eyes narrowing as he read, and for a brief moment, his expression held something close to disbelief, as if the answer did not match the shape of the story he had built in his head. "That is not hers," Boone said, straightening again, the words coming quicker now, as if speed might restore control. "You said this was about the widow," and Elias nodded once, because that part was true, but not in the way Boone expected. "It is," he replied, "but not the way you think." And the men around them listened without moving, because something in Elias's tone suggested that whatever came next had been waiting a long time to be heard. The sun dipped lower behind the ridge, casting the land in a softer light, and for a moment, everything looked almost unchanged: the house, the fence, the road stretching beyond, but the feeling beneath it had shifted, like a story turning its final page. "Her husband did not leave this land to her," Elias said, each word landing clean, leaving no space for confusion. "He left it to someone he trusted to hold it until the right time." And the weight of that sentence settled over the yard, heavier than any threat, heavier than any raised voice, because now the question was no longer about Boone's claim. It was about the name that came next, and who had been standing there all along holding the truth in his hands. No one asked the question out loud, but every man standing there felt it settle in their chest, because when a truth hangs in the air long enough, it begins to demand a name. Boone's eyes stayed fixed on the paper, then slowly lifted to Elias, searching his face for something that would break the moment, something that would turn this back into a simple claim, a simple mistake. But Elias did not move, did not soften, did not offer anything that could be used against him. The last light of day slipped lower, brushing across the edge of the document, and the name written there seemed to darken with it, as if the land itself was pulling attention toward it. Boone swallowed once, subtle but visible, then stepped closer, just enough to read it clearly this time. No guessing, no distance to blur the truth, and when he saw it, his expression did not explode, did not fall apart. It simply tightened, like a man realizing the ground beneath him had never been his to stand on. "That name," Boone said slowly, his voice lower now, stripped of the ease it carried before. "That is you." And it was not a question, not really. More like a confirmation he did not want but could not deny. Elias gave a small nod. Nothing more, because the paper had already said everything that needed saying. The men by the fence exchanged brief glances, not speaking, not stepping forward, just recalculating in silence. Because the balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Boone looked back at the land, the half-set posts, the porch, the empty space where Margaret's life had stood that morning, and for a moment, something unreadable crossed his face. Not guilt, not regret, just the recognition of a misstep that could not be hidden anymore. "So you have been holding it," he said, his tone steadier now, as if finding a new footing. "All this time." And Elias turned his gaze from the paper to the house, letting his eyes rest there for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring the years that had passed without him. "I was asked to," he replied, simple, direct, with no weight added, because the weight was already there. Boone let out a breath through his nose, then straightened slightly, the old confidence trying to return, though it did not settle the same way it had before. "Then why is she the one who lived here?" Boone asked, a trace of challenge returning. "Why not you?" And this time Elias did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because some answers require a moment of silence to be understood. The wind moved through the posts again, softer now, carrying the faint creak of wood that had stood longer than any of them. And Elias finally looked back at Boone, his expression unchanged. "Because it was never mine to live on," he said, "only mine to protect." And the sentence settled deeper than the others, because it did not argue, it did not accuse, it simply drew a line that had been there long before Boone arrived. One of the men near the fence lowered his hammer without realizing it, the sound of metal against wood fading into nothing. And for a brief moment, the entire yard stood still, caught between what had been claimed and what was true. Boone glanced once more at the paper, then at Elias, and something in his posture shifted again. Not surrender, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when a man understands he is no longer the one deciding how the story ends. And somewhere beyond the ridge, where the road stretched back toward the place Margaret had walked away from, the last light disappeared, leaving only the quiet weight of what had just been revealed and the question of what would come next. The night did not fall all at once. It settled slow over the land, turning edges soft and voices quieter. And under that dimming sky, the weight of what had been revealed did not lift, it pressed deeper. Boone stood where he was, no longer looking at the house or the fence, but at Elias, measuring him now not as a stranger returning to town, but as the man whose name had been sitting beneath everything all along. The men nearby did not move back to their work. They lingered, hands idle, eyes shifting, because once doubt enters a place, it does not leave easily. Boone adjusted his stance, drawing in a breath that sounded steadier than it felt, and spoke again. "You say you were meant to protect it." His voice controlled, but thinner now. "Then where were you this morning?" And the question hung there, not sharp, but pointed enough to reach. Elias did not react to it the way another man might have, no defense. No explanation offered too quickly, just a pause, long enough to let the question settle into its proper place. He looked past Boone, toward the horizon where the last trace of light had already faded, then back again, and when he spoke, it was not to justify, only to state. "Not here," he said, simple as that. And the answer did not close the gap Boone had tried to open, it widened it, because it carried no apology, only fact. Boone's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the realization that the ground he had tried to shift was not going to move the way he expected. "Then you left her alone," Boone pressed, softer now, as if lowering his voice might give the words more weight. "On land you claim you were meant to protect." And this time, a few of the men nearby glanced at Elias, not with accusation, but with something closer to curiosity, because now the story had turned, and they wanted to see where it would land. Elias lowered the paper just slightly, not hiding it, not putting it away, just easing it down as if the truth it carried did not need to be held up anymore. He took one step back, placing himself just outside the line of the newly driven posts, as if drawing a boundary that did not need to be spoken. Protection is not always standing in the way, he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach every ear in that yard. Sometimes it is making sure no one can take what was never theirs. And the words did not strike like a challenge. They settled like something already decided. Boone watched him for a long moment, then let his gaze drift to the men he had brought with him. Men who now stood quieter than before, their earlier certainty gone, replaced by the kind of hesitation that comes when a plan begins to unravel without noise. One of them shifted his weight, another looked toward the road as if measuring distance, and Boone saw it. He saw the shift. Even if he did not acknowledge it out loud, he turned back to Elias. And for the first time, there was no trace of the earlier ease in his expression, only calculation, careful and contained. "You have a paper," Boone said finally, not dismissing it now, but not fully yielding either. "But this land has been empty all day." And the statement carried a different kind of weight, not a challenge, but a suggestion, as if he was trying to find a place where his claim could still stand. Elias met his gaze without hesitation, the kind of stillness that does not invite argument, only recognition. "It was never empty," he replied, and the sentence seemed to settle into the ground itself, quiet and firm, because some things remain even when they are not seen, and under that darkening sky. Every man standing there understood that what had been taken in the morning had not been lost, only moved, and that the night ahead was not going to erase what had just come back into the light. The darkness settled deeper over Dry Creek, but no lantern was lit on that porch, no fire welcomed the night, because something unfinished held every man exactly where he stood, caught between what had been claimed and what had just been proven. Boone shifted his weight again, slower this time, as if each movement needed to be reconsidered before it was made, and the confidence that had carried him all morning now felt like a coat that no longer fit. The men behind him waited without instruction, their silence no longer loyal, but uncertain, because they had followed a claim, not a truth, and now those two things stood apart in the open air. Elias remained where he was, just beyond the line of new posts, the paper lowered at his side, no longer something to display, but something already understood, and his stillness did more than any threat could have done. It left no room for argument to grow. Boone glanced once toward the house, the empty doorway, the chair that had been left behind, and something in his expression flickered, not regret, but recognition, as if the absence itself had become evidence. "You expect me to walk away," Boone said, the words quiet but carrying, not defiant, not yielding, just testing the ground one last time, and Elias did not answer right away, because the question was not about expectation, it was about choice. The wind moved again, brushing through the unfinished fence, the loose boards giving a soft, uneven creak, like something that had been built too quickly and now did not know how to stand. Elias looked at the posts, then at the land beyond them, and finally back at Boone, his voice low, steady, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "I do not expect anything," he said. "I only brought back what was already here." And the sentence landed without force, without demand, and that was what made it final. Boone held his gaze for a long moment, searching for something to push against, something to argue, but found nothing that would hold, because the truth did not shift, it did not bend, it simply remained. One of Boone's men took a small step back, then another, not leaving, not yet, but creating distance from something that no longer felt like his to stand beside, and the others followed in quiet, almost unnoticed movement, because no one wanted to be the first to admit the change, but all of them felt it. Boone noticed, of course he did, and for a second, his jaw tightened again, not in anger, but in the understanding that whatever authority he had carried into this place had begun to slip through his hands without a single raised voice. He looked once more at Elias, then at the paper, then at the land that had never answered to him, and the silence stretched long enough to make the decision feel heavier than it was. Finally, he stepped back, just one pace. But it was enough to shift the line that had been drawn hours earlier, enough to tell every man there that something had changed. He did not speak again, not because he could not, but because there was nothing left to say that would alter what stood in front of him. The night deepened, the sky turning a darker shade above the ridge, and in that quiet, the unfinished fence stood as it was, neither claimed nor defended, just waiting. Elias remained still for a moment longer, then folded the paper once more, careful, deliberate, as if returning it to its place carried more weight than revealing it had, and somewhere, far down the road, beyond the reach of lantern light and quiet men, a widow kept walking, unaware that the land she had left behind had not been lost, only waiting for her to come back. The night stretched long across the empty yard, and for the first time since morning, no one gave an order, no one lifted a tool, because when a man steps back from something he claimed, the silence that follows carries more weight than any command. Boone stood still for a moment after that single step, as if testing whether the ground would hold him in this new position, then slowly turned his gaze away from the house, away from the porch that no longer answered to him, and toward the road. Because sometimes leaving begins with nothing more than deciding where not to stand. One of his men cleared his throat softly, not to speak, just to break the tension pressing down on his chest, and another shifted his hat lower, eyes no longer fixed on Elias but on the dirt beneath his boots, because it is easier to look away when the truth has already chosen its place. Boone did not speak to them, did not give direction, and that absence said more than anything he could have ordered, because men who follow certainty do not move when it disappears. After a long moment, he took another step back, then another, turning fully now, not in defeat, but in recognition that this ground no longer belonged to his story, and without a word, he walked toward his horse, the sound of his boots against the dirt steady, controlled, as if he still held something no one could take from him. The others followed, one by one, not hurried, not scattered, just leaving in the same quiet they had arrived with, until the yard was empty again, save for the unfinished fence and the house that had watched everything without a voice. Elias did not move right away. He stood there a few seconds longer, listening to the absence settle, because sometimes silence needs time to become real, and when it did, he let out a slow breath, not relief, not victory, just the release of something that had been waiting to be done. He stepped forward then, crossing the line of new posts without hesitation, boots pressing into the same soil. Margaret had walked that morning and reached out to one of the loose boards, running his hand along its edge, feeling the difference between what had stood for years and what had been forced into place in a single day. The wood creaked softly under his touch, not resisting, just reminding him that not everything built quickly is meant to last. He moved toward the porch, each step measured, not rushed, and when he reached it, he paused at the bottom, looking up at the door, the frame worn from time, the hinges carrying the memory of countless mornings and quiet evenings, and for a second, he did not go further, as if crossing that threshold carried more weight than stepping into any fight. Instead, he reached into his coat once more, pulling out the folded paper and holding it in his hand, not opening it, just feeling its presence, because the truth it carried had already done what it needed to do. Far down the road, beyond the reach of the town's quiet, Margaret Hale had slowed her pace, not from exhaustion, but from something she could not name, a pull that did not come from memory alone, and she stopped, just for a moment, turning her head slightly as if listening to something. Carried on the wind, though there was nothing there but the soft sound of night settling over open land. Back at the house, Elias stepped onto the porch, the wood giving a familiar sound beneath his weight, and without knocking, without hesitation, he pushed the door open just enough to look inside, not entering yet, just letting the past meet the present in that narrow space. Because some returns do not begin with a step, they begin with a pause. The door did not creak loudly when Elias pushed it open. It gave way with a soft, familiar sound, like it recognized the weight behind his hand, and the air inside carried that quiet stillness only a lived-in place can hold, not empty, just waiting. He stepped in slowly, boots brushing dust that had not yet settled from the morning's departure, and his eyes moved across the room without hurry, taking in the small details that do not belong to strangers, the folded blanket on the chair, the cup left near the window, the faint outline on the wall where something had once hung and been taken down. Nothing had been broken, nothing disturbed, and that absence spoke louder than any damage could have, because it meant she had left with dignity, not force. Elias closed the door halfway behind him, leaving it just open enough for the night air to slip through, and for a moment, he stood there in the center of the room, not moving, not touching anything, just letting the space speak in the only way it could. Outside, the unfinished fence cast long, uneven shadows under the rising moon, the posts standing like questions that had not yet been answered, and the town beyond had gone quiet, as if it knew better than to interfere with what was unfolding here. Elias walked to the table near the window and set the folded paper down, careful, deliberate, placing it where it could not be missed, not hidden, not claimed, just present, because some truths are not meant to be held onto, only. Returned, he glanced toward the corner where an old tin box sat on a shelf, untouched, and for a second, his gaze lingered there, not out of curiosity, but recognition, as if he knew what it carried without opening it. The years between now and the day. He had been handed that responsibility pressed lightly against his shoulders, not as a burden, but as something completed, something that had reached its end without needing acknowledgement. Far down the road, Margaret Hale had turned around without fully deciding to, her steps slower now, not uncertain, but drawn by something she could not explain, a quiet pull that did not belong to memory alone. And as she walked back the way she had come, the distance did not feel as long as it had before, as if the land itself had shortened the path for her return. Back inside the house, Elias moved toward the door again, not staying, not settling, because this had never been his place to keep, and when he stepped back onto the porch, the night wrapped around him in that same steady quiet, the kind that follows when something has been set right without noise. He paused at the top step, looking out over the yard, the fence, the road stretching into darkness, and for a moment, nothing moved, not the wind, not the shadows, just the stillness of a place that had been returned to itself. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps on dirt, soft, measured, approaching from the distance, and Elias did not turn immediately. He simply stood there, knowing that some arrivals do not need to be announced. They are felt long before they are seen. The sound came again, soft against the dirt, steady but unhurried, and this time Elias turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge what he had already known was there. Margaret Hale stood at the edge of the yard, no more than 30 yards away, her figure outlined by the faint moonlight, shoulders squared not in defiance, but in quiet endurance, the kind that does not ask permission to return. She did not speak at first, and neither did he, because some moments are not meant to be broken by words. They are meant to settle between two people who understand more than they say. Her eyes moved across the land slowly, taking in the fence, the posts, the house, everything exactly where it had been, and yet not the same, as if the place itself had been holding its breath waiting for her to come back. She took a few steps forward, boots pressing into familiar ground, and stopped again, closer now, close enough to see the outline of Elias on the porch, standing still, not approaching, not retreating, simply present. "I thought it was gone," she said finally, her voice low, not fragile, just honest, and the words carried across the space between them without effort. Elias did not answer right away, because what she said was not a question. It was a truth she had carried all day, and truths like that do not need correction. They need time. He stepped down from the porch then, one step at a time, the wood giving its quiet acknowledgement beneath his boots, until he stood on the ground facing her, the distance between them narrowing but not disappearing. "It was never gone," he said after a moment, his voice steady, the same tone he had carried all evening, not louder, not softer, just certain, and Margaret held his gaze, searching it not for proof, but for something else, something harder to name. She glanced past him toward the door, slightly open, and something shifted in her expression, not relief, not quite, but recognition, like seeing something familiar after believing it lost. "They had papers," she said, almost to herself, the memory still close, still present, and Elias nodded once, because he had seen them, had held them, had understood what they were meant to do. "They had copies," he replied, "not the truth." And the distinction settled quietly, not argued, not explained, just placed where it belonged. Margaret let out a slow breath, the kind that does not release everything, only enough to keep standing, and she took another step forward, now just a few feet away, close enough to see the lines in his face, the years that had passed without crossing this distance. "You were not here," she said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what had been, and Elias met that without turning away. "No," he said. And for a second, that was all there was. The admission without defense, without excuse. The night held still around them. The house behind him, the road behind her, both paths meeting in that small space between where neither had stood before. Then he reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the folded paper, not raising it, not presenting it like before, just holding it in his hand where she could see it. And for the first time, something in her posture changed, not a step back, not hesitation, but the recognition that whatever had taken her from this place had not been stronger than what now stood in front of her. "It was always yours to live on," Elias said quietly, not stepping closer, not closing the distance for her. "I was only asked to make sure no one could take it away." And the words did not ask for forgiveness, did not ask for understanding. They simply laid the truth where it could be seen. And in that moment, Margaret did not reach for the paper, did not move at all. She just stood there, looking at it, at him, at the space that had been held in silence for years, and the night around them seemed to settle into something steadier, as if the land itself had recognized that what was lost had found its way back without needing to be claimed again. Margaret did not reach for the paper right away, because some things carry too much weight to be taken in a single motion, and instead she let her eyes rest on it, then on Elias, then on the house behind him, as if measuring whether what stood before her was real or simply something the night had shaped from memory. The wind moved lightly across the yard, brushing against her coat, lifting a strand of her hair, and in that quiet, she took one slow step forward, then another, closing the space. Not out of urgency, but because standing still no longer made sense. Elias did not move to meet her. He held his place, the paper still in his hand, not offered, not withheld, simply there, waiting for the moment she chose to take it or not. When she finally stopped just within arm's reach, she looked down at the document again, the seal faintly catching the moonlight now, less sharp than it had been in the sun, but no less real. And for a second, her fingers lifted slightly, as if to reach for it, then paused, hovering in the space between intention and action. "If it was never yours," she said quietly, her voice steady but softer than before, "then why keep it all these years?" And the question did not carry doubt. It carried something closer to understanding that had not fully settled yet. Elias lowered his hand just a fraction, enough to ease the distance without closing it, and his gaze shifted briefly toward the horizon before returning to her, because the answer did not belong only to this moment. It belonged to everything that had led to it. "Because he asked me to," he said, simple, without weight added, without explanation layered over it. And Margaret held that answer for a second, letting it rest where it belonged, not questioning it further, because sometimes the truth arrives complete, needing nothing more. Her hand moved then, slowly, deliberately, and this time it did not stop, her fingers closing around the edge of the paper, feeling the texture of it. The years pressed into its folds, and when Elias released it, he did so without hesitation, without holding on for even a moment longer than necessary. She unfolded it carefully, the motion quiet in the still night, and her eyes traced the lines one by one, not rushing, not skimming, reading each word as if it mattered, because it did, every line, every signature, every mark that had carried her home without her knowing it. The name at the bottom held her gaze longer than the rest, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had stood between her and this moment without ever standing in her way. And she looked up again, meeting Elias's eyes with something different now, not uncertainty, not distance, but recognition. "You never used it," she said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time. And Elias shook his head once, small, almost unnoticeable, because there was no need to say more. The house behind him stood open, the door still slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for this moment as well. And Margaret glanced toward it, then back at him, the paper still in her hands. "You could have," she added, and this time there was something quieter beneath the words, something that acknowledged what had not been taken. Elias did not answer that, not because he could not, but because the answer was already there in everything he had not done. The silence that followed was not empty. It held meaning, held years, held choices made without witness, and after a moment, Margaret folded the paper again, not the way it had been before, but her way now, and held it close against her side. She turned slightly toward the house, her steps not hurried, not hesitant, just certain, and as she moved past Elias, she paused for a fraction of a second beside him, not looking at him, not speaking, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance. Then she stepped onto the porch, the wood answering her weight the way it always had, and without looking back, she reached for the door and pushed it open wider, letting the night air follow her inside, while Elias remained where he was, standing just below the steps, watching not the house, not the land, but the quiet way everything had been returned without a single word needing to claim it. The door closed softly behind Margaret Hale, not with finality, but with the quiet assurance of something returning to where it had always belonged. And inside, the faint sound of her footsteps moved across the wooden floor, slow, deliberate, as if each step was reclaiming more than space, reclaiming time itself. Outside, Elias Crow remained where he stood at the base of the porch, his silhouette steady against the dim light spilling from the doorway, not watching her, not listening for anything more, just allowing the moment to settle the way it needed to. The wind moved gently through the unfinished fence, brushing against the loose boards, and one by one, they shifted slightly, not falling, not breaking, just adjusting, as if even the wood understood that it had been placed in the wrong story. Far across the land, the town of Dry Creek held its silence, the kind that follows when something undeniable has taken place, when no voice dares to rise above what everyone has already seen. Elias lifted his gaze once more toward the house, not to check, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge, and for a brief second, the light inside flickered, casting her shadow against the wall, moving with purpose, not hesitation, and that was enough. He reached up and adjusted his hat, a small gesture, almost unnoticeable, then turned away from the porch without another look, his boots pressing into the dirt with the same steady rhythm they had carried him there. He did not step back over the new fence line, did not remove the posts, did not claim anything for himself, because there was nothing left to take, nothing left to prove. The road stretched ahead into darkness, familiar and empty, and he walked it, without hurry, the sound of his steps fading slowly into the night until they were no longer heard, only remembered. Behind him, inside the house, Margaret moved to the table near the window and set the folded paper down once more, her hand resting on it for a moment longer than necessary, not to hold it, but to feel its presence, to understand what it had carried through years she had never seen. She looked around the room again. The same walls, the same worn edges, the same quiet, but something had shifted, not in the place, but in the way it stood, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain. She walked to the door once more and opened it slightly, letting the cool night air drift inside. And for a moment, she stood there, looking out across the yard, the unfinished fence, the land stretching beyond, and though she could no longer see him, she knew he had gone, the way one knows something without needing to witness it. Her eyes rested on the line where the new posts had been set, then beyond it, to where the old boundary had always been, and slowly, almost without thinking, she stepped back inside and closed the door again, not shutting anything out, only drawing a line that did not need to be spoken. Outside, the land remained still, unchanged, and yet completely different, the kind of stillness that comes when something has been set right without force, without noise, without anyone claiming victory. And in that quiet, beneath a sky that had seen too many stories to remember them all, one truth remained where it had always been, not written in ink, not carried in paper, but held in the simple act of a man who chose not to take what he could have, and a woman who returned to what had never truly been taken from her.